There was a time when people understood that a family could not be measured only by the person who brought home the largest paycheck. Money mattered. But so did the meals prepared before sunrise, the children cared for during sickness, the bills managed during unemployment, the sacrifices made when nobody was watching. Some work appeared on a salary statement. Other work appeared in the fact that a family survived. But on one unforgettable afternoon, a husband named Glenn Parker looked at his wife and told the entire world that she contributed nothing. The Family Feud studio was filled with bright lights, music, and excited applause. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage as two families waved from behind their podiums. On one side stood the Robinson family from Georgia. On the other stood the Parker family from Dayton, Ohio. Glenn Parker stood in the captain's position. He was 52 years old and worked as the general manager of a large automobile dealership. He wore a fitted black suit, a white shirt, and a silver watch that caught the studio lights whenever he moved his hands. Glenn was confident, loud, and comfortable being the center of attention. Beside him stood his wife, Nora. Nora was 50 years old. She wore a burgundy dress and a small gold necklace shaped like a rolling pin. Their 26-year-old daughter, Jasmine, stood next to her. Glenn's 74-year-old mother, Beatrice, and Nora's younger brother, Marcus, completed the family team. Steve began the introductions. He approached Glenn first. "What do you do, sir?" "I manage one of the largest car dealerships in Ohio." Steve nodded. "How many people work there?" "Almost 90. "That is a lot of responsibility." Glenn smiled proudly. "I know how to keep people working." The audience laughed. Steve moved toward Nora. "And what do you do?" Nora leaned toward the microphone. "I run a small baking business from home." Before she could explain, Glenn laughed loudly. Steve looked toward him. "What is funny?" Glenn waved one hand. "She makes cakes for church people and neighbors." Nora's smile weakened. "It is a registered business." Glenn leaned toward his microphone. "She likes calling it that." A few people laughed politely. Jasmine looked at her father. "Dad," Glenn continued, "she stays home, mixes flour, and spends the money I earn." The audience became quieter. Nora looked down at the podium. Steve studied Glenn's face. "You said she spends the money you earn? That is marriage, Steve, and she does not earn anything?" Glenn shrugged. "A few $100s here and there." Nora looked at him. "That is not true." Glenn laughed. "Come on, Nora," she placed both hands on the podium. "My business earns money. After ingredients, delivery, decorations, electricity, and all those little supplies?" "Yes," Glenn shook his head. "That is not real income." The audience reacted with discomfort. Steve looked toward Nora. "What is the name of your business?" "Sunday Table Bakery." "That sounds nice." "It was my mother's idea." Glenn interrupted again. "It is a hobby with a logo." Nora's eyes filled with hurt. Jasmine stepped closer to her. Steve slowly lowered his question card. "How long have you been married?" 28 years, Nora answered. Steve looked at Glenn. "And after 28 years, you believe she contributes nothing?" Glenn smiled as if the answer were obvious. "I provide the house, the insurance, the cars, and the lifestyle." Nora stared at him. Glenn continued, "I love my wife, but if we are talking about contribution, I carry the family." Beatrice closed her eyes. Marcus looked toward Glenn with anger. Jasmine shook her head, but Glenn did not notice the reaction. He was too busy enjoying the attention. What he did not know was that 3 people standing beside him knew exactly how much Nora had contributed. They knew who had paid the mortgage when Glenn lost his job. They knew who had cared for Beatrice after a serious stroke. They knew who had postponed a nursing career to help their injured son recover. They knew who had quietly paid Glenn's tax debt before his employer discovered it. And they knew that Sunday Table Bakery was not a hobby. It had earned more than Glenn realized because Nora had used most of the money to protect the family from problems Glenn had created. Before the game ended, Steve would ask a few simple questions. Those questions would expose the lie Glenn had told in front of everyone. By the end of the afternoon, Glenn would learn that the family had never survived because one man carried everyone. It survived because Nora had spent 28 years carrying responsibilities Glenn rarely stopped to see. Nora Parker grew up in a small house with her mother, father, and younger brother. Her mother, Evelyn, worked in a school cafeteria. Her father repaired heating systems. The family did not have much money, but their home was always full of food and visitors. Evelyn believed that feeding people was one of the clearest ways to show love. If a neighbor became sick, she baked bread. If a family lost a loved one, she prepared enough food to last several days. If a child arrived hungry, Evelyn never asked questions before placing a plate on the table. Every Sunday afternoon, Evelyn baked cakes and pies for relatives, church members, and neighbors. Nora stood beside her in the kitchen. She learned how to measure ingredients without looking at a recipe. She learned how to tell when bread was ready by tapping the bottom. She learned that a cake made for someone's birthday was not only dessert, it was proof that somebody had remembered. Evelyn called the kitchen their Sunday table. "Everybody deserves a place at the table," she often said. Nora planned to become a nurse. She was intelligent, patient, and calm during emergencies. After high school, she entered a nursing program at a local community college. That was where she met Glenn. Glenn was studying business management. He was charming, ambitious, and always talking about the future. He wanted an important job, a large house, a family that never struggled financially. Nora admired his determination. Glenn admired her warmth. They married shortly after Nora completed her first year of nursing school. At first, they planned for Nora to finish her training. Then she became pregnant with Jasmine. Nora took one semester away from school. After Jasmine was born, money became tight. Glenn was working at a used car lot and earning commissions. Some months were strong, other months were difficult. Nora began baking cakes from home to help cover groceries and baby expenses. She still planned to return to school. 2 years later, their son Caleb was born. Nora delayed school again. When Caleb was 9, the Parker family experienced a crisis that changed everything. Caleb was riding in a car with a friend's family when another vehicle ran a red light. The collision caused a serious spinal injury. Caleb survived, but he lost the use of his legs. For months, the family lived between hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and home. Glenn continued working because they needed income and health insurance. Nora became Caleb's primary caregiver. She learned how to transfer him safely from bed to wheelchair. She managed medication. She attended physical therapy sessions. She fought with the school district for accessibility support. She stayed awake when Caleb suffered pain and muscle spasms. She helped him return to school when he believed everyone would stare. Nora's nursing education helped, but she was never paid for the work. She stopped talking about returning to college. Caleb needed her. Jasmine needed stability. Glenn needed the household to continue functioning while he worked long hours. During the first year after the accident, Glenn was grateful. He often told Nora, "I do not know how you do it." Nora replied, "I do it because he is our son." But as the years passed, Glenn began treating her sacrifice as a permanent arrangement. He advanced in the automobile business. He moved from salesperson to finance manager, then to assistant general manager. His income increased. He began referring to himself as the provider. When people asked what Nora did, Glenn said she stayed home with the children. He did not mention medical care, school meetings, therapy schedules, household management, or the cakes she continued making at night. Caleb gradually became more independent. He learned to drive an adapted vehicle. He joined a wheelchair basketball team. He later attended college. Nora was proud of him. But the years of caregiving had changed her life. Her nursing credits had expired. Returning to the program would require beginning almost completely again. By then, Nora was in her 40s. She considered it, but another crisis arrived. Beatrice, Glenn's mother, suffered a stroke. The stroke affected her speech, balance, and memory. Glenn had 2 sisters, but both lived in other states. Beatrice needed daily support. Glenn suggested moving her into their home. Nora agreed. For almost 3 years, Nora cared for Beatrice. She prepared meals that were easy to swallow. She managed medication. She drove her to therapy. She helped her bathe. She practiced speech exercises with her every morning. Beatrice often became frustrated when words would not come. Nora never rushed her. When Glenn returned home, He usually asked whether his mother had taken her medicine. He rarely asked what caring for her had required. At family gatherings, Glenn told people, "We decided Mom should live with us." He did not say that Nora had rearranged her entire day. He did not say she had converted the guest room, organized medical supplies, and slept lightly because Beatrice sometimes tried to leave the house at night. Nora never demanded praise. She believed families helped one another. But she noticed that Glenn's language kept changing. At first he said, "We are taking care of Mom." Later he said, "I take care of everybody." Nora's baking business grew during those years. What began with birthday cakes for neighbors became a steady stream of orders. A local cafe began buying her pies. A wedding planner recommended her cakes. Church members shared photographs online. Jasmine created a social media page and designed a logo. They named the business Sunday Table Bakery in honor of Evelyn. Nora worked early in the morning or late at night. She prepared orders after Beatrice went to sleep. She kept careful records. She paid taxes. She purchased insurance. She earned far more than a few $100s. But most of the money did not remain in her personal account. It went into the family. When Caleb needed an adapted vehicle, Nora paid the down payment. Glenn told relatives he had purchased the van for his son. Nora said nothing. When Jasmine entered college, Nora paid for books and housing deposits. Glenn told people his salary was putting 2 children through school. Again, Nora said nothing. Then, Glenn lost his job. The dealership where he worked was purchased by a larger company. Several managers were removed. Glenn had built his identity around his career. Being unemployed affected him deeply. He became withdrawn and angry. He did not want friends or relatives to know. He continued wearing suits when he left the house so neighbors would assume he was going to work. For 14 months, Glenn searched for another management position. During that time, Sunday Table Bakery paid most of the mortgage. Nora increased production. She accepted large catering orders. She baked through the night. Jasmine helped with deliveries. Marcus managed some of the accounting. Caleb created an online ordering system. The entire family worked. Glenn helped occasionally, but he refused to tell anyone that the bakery was supporting them. "It is temporary," he said. Nora protected his pride. When Beatrice asked how the family was managing, Nora said they had savings. When friends asked why Glenn was home, Nora said he was considering better opportunities. She never publicly described him as unemployed. Eventually, Glenn was hired as general manager of a dealership. His income increased again. He thanked Nora privately. But once the crisis passed, he returned to calling the bakery a hobby. Nora reminded him that her work had paid the mortgage. Glenn replied, "For a few months. It was more than a year. I would have found a solution." "You did find one." Glenn looked confused. Nora pointed toward herself. "Me?" Glenn did not respond. The most serious problem happened 3 years before the family feud appearance. Glenn received a letter from the tax authorities. During his unemployment, he had withdrawn money from a retirement account. He had not handled the taxes correctly. Interest and penalties had grown. The family owed nearly $48,000. Glenn hid the first letter. Then another arrived. Nora discovered it while organizing household papers. She confronted him. "Why did you not tell me? I was going to fix it." "With what?" "My bonus. The payment deadline is next month." Glenn became defensive. "I do not need you treating me like a child. I am asking why you hid a serious debt. I did not want you worrying." Nora stared at him. "You keep making decisions alone and calling it protection. The tax debt could have led to wage garnishment and other financial consequences. It might also have embarrassed Glenn at work." Nora used money from the bakery's business account to settle most of it. She then worked for a year to rebuild the bakery's savings. Glenn promised to repay the money. He never did. He also asked Nora not to tell the children or Beatrice. She kept his secret. That decision created resentment inside her. Nora had spent years turning her labor into protection for the family. Glenn turned his salary into proof that only his work mattered. 6 months before the game show appearance, Nora began considering expansion. A small storefront became available near a hospital. She wanted to open a bakery cafe that would also provide free meals to families staying near the hospital during medical emergencies. The idea brought together everything she valued: food, care, community, her mother's Sunday table. Nora prepared a business plan. The numbers were strong. The bakery had enough regular customers to support a small location. Jasmine offered to manage marketing. Caleb could oversee online orders. Marcus agreed to help with financial systems. Nora showed the plan to Glenn. He barely looked at it. "You do not need a storefront. The business has grown. You already take over the kitchen. I need commercial space. That costs money." "I have savings." Glenn looked surprised. "How much?" Nora hesitated. "Almost $65,000. Glenn stared at her. "From cakes? Yes, why did you not tell me? You never asked. That is family money. It is business money." Glenn became angry. "You earn it from a business that operates in my house. Our house. I pay the mortgage." Nora looked at him. "Not always." Glenn understood the reference. He walked away. From that day he became more dismissive of Sunday table bakery. He called it a hobby in front of friends. He joked that Nora spent more on sugar than she earned. He discouraged her from opening the storefront. Nora began wondering whether Glenn feared her success. Jasmine saw the tension. She submitted the family's Family Feud application, partly because she hoped the experience would remind her parents how much they had survived together. Instead, the stage gave Glenn a place to repeat his lie in front of everyone. The first round began with an ordinary question. Name something people buy when they suddenly have extra money. Glenn reached the buzzer first. A car. It was the number one answer. The Parker family chose to play. Jasmine answered clothes. Beatrice answered a vacation. Marcus answered a new television. All three appeared on the board. Steve reached Nora. Something people buy when they suddenly have extra money. Pay off debt. The answer appeared. The audience applauded. Glenn laughed. That is not buying anything. Steve looked at the board. It is an answer. Glenn shook his head. Nora is always thinking about bills. Nora replied quietly, somebody has to. Steve noticed the tension. The family cleared the board and won the round. During the second round, Steve asked, name something people do at home that deserves more appreciation. The Robinson family gained control, but received 3 strikes. The Parkers had a chance to steal. Jasmine suggested cooking. Beatrice suggested caregiving. Marcus suggested cleaning. Nora said, managing the money. Glenn chose cleaning. The buzzer sounded. Wrong. The Robinson family kept the points. Steve revealed the remaining answer. Managing the money. Nora had been correct. The audience applauded. Steve pointed toward her. She had it. Glenn smiled. She worries about money because she does not earn much. The studio became quiet. Nora looked toward him. Marcus shook his head. Glenn, what? Steve stepped closer. You keep saying she does not earn much. She has a baking hobby. Nora replied, it is a business. Glenn laughed. A business pays the family. Jasmine stared at him. Dad, stop. Glenn ignored her. Steve looked at Nora. Does your business pay the family? Nora hesitated. Yes. Glenn shook his head. Not in any serious way. Beatrice leaned toward her microphone. That is not true. Glenn turned toward his mother. Mom. Beatrice's speech was slower after the stroke, but her words were clear. Nora paid for my care. The audience reacted. Glenn looked confused. No, my insurance paid for most of it. Beatrice shook her head. Not the home care worker. Glenn looked at Nora. You said we could afford that. We could. With what? The bakery. The audience became quiet. Glenn's face tightened. That was family money. Steve asked, how much did the care cost? Nora answered carefully. Almost $22,000 over 3 years. Glenn stared at her. You paid that? Yes. Beatrice reached for Nora's hand. She also cared for me every day. The audience applauded. Glenn became defensive. I never said she did nothing around the house. Steve looked at him. You said she contributes nothing. I meant financially. Steve pointed toward Nora. She just told you she paid $22,000 for your mother's care. Glenn said nothing. The game continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The third round question was, Name something people sacrifice for their family. The Parkers won control. Jasmine answered time. It was the #1 response. Marcus answered money. Beatrice answered career. Both appeared. Steve reached Nora. She looked at the board. Sleep, the answer appeared. Steve smiled. You sound like you have experience. Nora laughed softly. Many years. Glenn said, she chooses to stay up baking. Jasmine turned toward him. She stayed up baking because you did not have a job. The audience gasped. Glenn stared at his daughter. What are you doing? Jasmine's eyes filled with emotion. You keep saying Mom contributes nothing. This is not the place to discuss that. Steve looked directly at Glenn. You made it the place. The audience applauded. Jasmine continued. Dad was unemployed for 14 months. Glenn looked toward the cameras. It was a company restructuring. No one is judging you for losing your job, Jasmine said. She pointed toward Nora. We are judging you for pretending Mom did not support us. Glenn crossed his arms. We had savings. Marcus spoke next. The savings were gone after 4 months. Glenn looked at him. You were not part of our finances. I handled the bakery's accounts. The audience reacted. Steve looked toward Marcus. You helped with the business? Yes. How much did it earn during those 14 months? Marcus looked at Nora. She seemed uncomfortable. Glenn immediately said, we do not need exact numbers. Steve shook his head. You were comfortable with exact words when you said nothing. The audience applauded. Marcus answered. Sunday Table Bakery earned a little over $91,000 in gross revenue during that period. Glenn's expression changed. Steve raised his eyebrows. $91,000? Marcus nodded. After expenses and taxes, Nora used around $54,000 for household costs. The audience gasped. Jasmine continued. That paid the mortgage, utilities, food, and part of Caleb's adapted vehicle. Steve looked at Glenn. You were unemployed? Yes, and your wife paid the bills? Yes, but we are married. Steve nodded. That is right. He paused. So why does your salary count as contribution but hers becomes marriage? The audience stood. Glenn opened his mouth but could not answer. Steve continued. When you provide, you want recognition. He pointed toward Nora. When she provides, you want silence. The applause grew louder. Nora looked down as tears filled her eyes. Glenn became defensive. I found another job. No one said you did not. The family did not collapse. Nora looked at him. Because I did not let it. The studio became silent. Glenn stared at her. Nora had rarely spoken to him so directly in public. She continued. I baked until 3 in the morning. Glenn looked down. I woke up at 6 to help Caleb. Her voice trembled. I cared for your mother. Beatrice began crying. I delivered orders, managed the house, and told everyone you were considering better opportunities because you did not want people knowing you had been dismissed. Glenn's face became red. I did not ask you to lie. You asked me not to tell anyone. The audience reacted. Steve looked at Glenn. Did you? He nodded reluctantly. Yes, Nora continued. I protected your dignity. She took a breath. You repaid me by calling my work a hobby. The studio was completely silent. Glenn looked toward the floor, but the largest truth had not yet been revealed. Steve asked, what happened after he returned to work? Nora hesitated. Glenn immediately said we moved forward. Jasmine shook her head. No. Mom paid his tax debt. Glenn turned sharply. Jasmine. The audience gasped. Steve looked toward Nora. What tax debt? Nora closed her eyes. For 3 years she had protected the secret. Glenn had just spent the entire show denying her contribution. She could no longer carry both his reputation and her own erasure. Nora answered. He withdrew money from a retirement account during unemployment. Steve nodded. And? The taxes were not handled properly. How much was owed? Almost $48,000. The audience reacted loudly. Glenn looked angry. That was a private financial matter. Marcus stared at him. So was the money she used to fix it. Steve looked at Nora. Where did the money come from? Sunday Table Bakery. The audience erupted. Steve turned toward Glenn. The hobby paid a $48,000 debt. Glenn looked trapped. It was our money. Nora's voice became firm. No. The audience became quiet. It was money I had saved to open a storefront. Glenn looked at her. You never said that. I did not want you feeling worse. What do you mean? You were terrified your employer would discover the financial problem. Glenn looked toward the audience. I was not terrified. Nora stared at him. You cried in our bedroom. The studio became silent. Glenn's face collapsed. Nora immediately looked regretful. For years she had protected even that memory. I am not saying that to shame you. Glenn looked away. I am saying it because you keep pretending I did nothing while I used my dream to protect your career. Jasmine began crying. Beatrice held Nora's hand. Steve looked at Glenn. Did she use the storefront money to pay your debt? Yes, did you repay it? Glenn said nothing. Steve asked again. Did you repay your wife? No, did you recognize what she gave up? Glenn swallowed. I thanked her. Nora shook her head. You told me we would discuss the bakery later. Steve asked, did later come? Nora looked toward Glenn. No. The audience became quiet. Steve picked up his question card, but he did not resume the round. He stared at Glenn. You told us your wife contributes nothing. Glenn's voice was low. I was exaggerating. No. Steve stepped closer. You were rewriting history. The audience applauded. You erased the mortgage payments. He pointed toward Beatrice. You erased the care she gave your mother. He pointed toward Jasmine. You erased the money for your children. Then he pointed toward Glenn. You erased the debt she paid for you. Steve placed the question card on the podium. That is not exaggeration. He paused. That is a lie. Glenn stood silently. For the first time since the recording began, he did not have a confident answer. The audience was waiting. His family was waiting. Nora was waiting. Steve looked toward Nora. How much does Sunday Table Bakery earn now? Nora answered carefully. Last year, revenue was about $130,000. The audience gasped. Steve raised his eyebrows. From cakes? Nora smiled faintly. Cakes, pies, bread, meal trays, weddings, and corporate orders. Steve looked at Glenn. You called a business earning $130,000 a hobby? Glenn lowered his head. I did not know it was that much. Nora looked at him. You never asked. I thought most of it went back into supplies. I keep records. I know. Do you? The question hurt more than shouting would have. Nora continued. You know I bake. You know boxes leave the house. You know people send payments. But you never wanted to understand the business, because understanding it would mean admitting I built something. Glenn looked toward her. That is not true. Then why did you refuse to read my storefront plan? The audience became quiet. Glenn said, it was risky. You did not reach the financial section. I was busy. You laughed after the first page. Glenn's face tightened. Nora continued. You told me nobody would visit a bakery run by a 50-year-old woman. Jasmine stared at her father. You said that? Glenn shook his head. I was trying to make her realistic. Marcus replied, the existing customer list already supports a storefront. Glenn looked toward him. You are her brother. Of course you support it. Marcus held up his hands. I am also an accountant. The audience reacted. Steve smiled slightly. That sounds useful. Marcus continued. I reviewed the numbers. He looked toward Nora. The plan is strong. Glenn became frustrated. Everybody has been discussing this without me? Nora looked at him. I tried to discuss it with you. You did not tell me Marcus was involved. You stopped listening. The studio became silent. Steve nodded. That is how people get left out of decisions. He looked directly at Glenn. Not because others are hiding. Because they learn you will not hear them. Glenn's expression softened. Beatrice stepped toward her microphone. I want to say something. Steve nodded. Beatrice looked at her son. When I had the stroke, I could not speak clearly. Glenn looked toward her. Nora sat with me every morning. Her voice remained slow, but each word was deliberate. She helped me say my name. Nora began crying. Beatrice continued. She fed me. She cleaned me. She changed her life for me. Glenn wiped one eye. Beatrice looked toward Steve. My son visited. The studio became quiet. He paid bills. She looked back at Glenn. But Nora did the work that kept me human. The audience stood and applauded. Glenn covered his mouth. Beatrice continued. You tell people you took care of me. Glenn looked ashamed. I did. You helped. Beatrice pointed toward Nora. She cared. The difference between the words filled the room. Steve waited for the applause to settle. Then he asked Nora another question. What did your husband contribute during the years you were carrying all of this? Nora looked surprised. Glenn looked toward her. She could have attacked him. Instead, she answered honestly. He worked hard. The audience became quiet. He helped Caleb learn how to drive with hand controls. Glenn looked at his wife. He attended Jasmine's school events when I could not. Nora continued. He built a successful career. She wiped her tears. I have never said he contributed nothing. Steve nodded slowly. That is important. Nora looked directly at Glenn. I only wanted him to stop saying it about me. The audience applauded. Glenn's shoulders dropped. The truth had exposed more than numbers. It exposed the difference between Nora's view of marriage and his. Nora could recognize Glenn's contribution without denying her own. Glenn had built his importance by pretending only one person mattered. Steve looked toward the captain's position. Glenn, step back. Glenn looked up. What? You heard me. Glenn appeared embarrassed. I am the family captain. Steve pointed toward Nora. Not anymore. The audience erupted. Glenn started to respond. Steve raised one hand. You told us she contributes nothing. He pointed one position down the line. Let us see what happens when nothing leads the family. The audience cheered. Even Nora laughed through her tears. Glenn stepped back. Nora moved into the captain's position. Steve leaned closer. How does that feel? Uncomfortable. Why? I am used to working behind everyone. Steve smiled. That is exactly why you need to stand in front. The next round was worth triple points. Steve called Nora and the Robinson family captain to the buzzer. Name something a strong family gives each member. Nora pressed the buzzer. Support. The bell rang. It was the number one answer. The audience applauded. The Parker family chose to play. Jasmine answered love. Beatrice answered respect. Marcus answered security. All three appeared on the board. Only two answers remained. Steve reached Glenn. Something a strong family gives each member. Glenn looked toward Nora. Recognition. The bell rang. The answer appeared. The audience applauded. Nora looked at him. Glenn gave a small nod. One answer remained. The family received 2 strikes before the question returned to Nora. Steve repeated it. Name something a strong family gives each member. Nora thought about her mother. She thought about the Sunday table. She thought about Caleb, Beatrice, Jasmine, and the years of invisible work. A place to belong. The bell rang. The final answer appeared. The Parker family won the game. Confetti filled the stage. Jasmine hugged Nora. Beatrice and Marcus joined them. Glenn remained slightly behind. Nora turned toward him. After a moment, she allowed him to join the family embrace. But she remained at the center. Nora and Jasmine were selected for fast money. Jasmine played first and earned 136 points. Nora needed 64 points to win $20,000. Steve stood beside her at the fast money podium. You ready? I think so. You have done harder things than this. Nora smiled. Yes, sir. The clock began. Name something people make for a birthday. A cake. Name something every household needs. A budget. Name someone families call during an emergency. Mother. Name something people sacrifice to reach a dream. Sleep. Name something more valuable than a paycheck. Time. The buzzer sounded. The audience applauded. Steve smiled. You knew those answers. I have lived them. The results appeared. Cake earned 42 points. Budget earned 26. Mother earned 38. The Parker family passed 200 points. They had won $20,000. Jasmine ran onto the stage. Nora held her daughter as confetti continued falling. Steve handed Nora the prize card. "What are you doing with the money?" Nora looked toward Glenn. Then she looked toward the audience. "I am opening Sunday Table Bakery." The studio erupted. Glenn lowered his head. Steve smiled. "The storefront? Yes, what will make it different?" Nora touched the necklace shaped like a rolling pin. "My mother believed everybody deserved a place at the table." She continued, "The bakery will sell food, but one section will prepare free meal boxes for families caring for someone after an accident, stroke, or serious illness." Beatrice began crying. Nora looked toward her. "Caregivers often forget to eat." The audience applauded. "I want them to know somebody sees what they are doing." Steve nodded. "That sounds like more than a bakery." "It is." "What is it?" Nora smiled. "It is the dream I kept delaying for everybody else." After the recording ended, Glenn wanted to apologize immediately. Nora listened, but she did not allow the emotion of the stage to create a false resolution. She had heard apologies before. She wanted change. When the family returned home, Nora placed the bakery business plan on the kitchen table. Glenn sat across from her. For the first time, he read every page. He studied the revenue history. He reviewed customer demand. He examined equipment costs, projected rent, staffing needs, and cash reserves. After 20 minutes, he looked up. "This is detailed." Nora stared at him. "What did you expect?" Glenn had no answer. He continued reading. The plan included a catering schedule, online order projections, and agreements with 2 local organizations. The bakery was not an emotional idea. It was a prepared business. Glenn closed the folder. "I should have read this before. Yes, I should not have called it a hobby. No," his eyes filled with tears, "I should not have said you contributed nothing." Nora remained quiet. Glenn continued, "I think I needed to believe I carried the family." "Why?" "Because that was how I measured myself." Nora listened. "When I lost my job, I felt useless." Her expression softened slightly. "You were not useless. I know that now." He shook his head. "But at the time, your business kept growing while I was sitting at home." Nora nodded slowly. "You were ashamed." "Yes, so you made my work smaller." Glenn looked down. Yes, the honesty mattered. But it did not remove the damage. Nora told him she wanted marriage counseling. She also wanted complete financial transparency. Glenn could no longer hide debt, retirement withdrawals, or tax problems. They would review all shared accounts with an independent advisor. Glenn agreed. Nora also wanted separate business finances. Sunday Table Bakery would no longer function as an emergency account Glenn could assume belonged to the household. The bakery would pay Nora a salary. It would maintain reserves. Any family contribution would be discussed openly. Glenn initially looked uncomfortable. "We are married." "Yes." "Should we separate everything?" "Not everything." Nora looked directly at him. "But marriage does not mean one person's business is real, while the other person's money automatically becomes family rescue money." Glenn nodded. "That is fair." The independent financial review revealed no new hidden debts, but it showed how often Nora's income had protected the household. Over 10 years, Sunday Table Bakery had paid or contributed toward Caleb's adapted vehicle, Jasmine's college expenses, Beatrice's home care, mortgage payments during unemployment, the tax settlement, emergency household repairs, family medical costs. The total was more than $200,000. Glenn stared at the report. "I did not know." The advisor replied the records were available. Nora looked toward Glenn. "You did not count the money because you did not count the work." That sentence stayed with him. The Family Feud episode aired several months later. The public response was immediate. Viewers strongly reacted to Steve's question, "So why does your salary count as contribution, but hers becomes marriage?" Women wrote about unpaid labor. Some had left careers to raise children. Others cared for aging parents. Some managed family businesses without titles. Many had earned money from home while their husbands called it extra cash. Men also responded. Several admitted they had used the phrase "my money" even when their wives' unpaid work made their careers possible. One man wrote that his wife had managed their household and cared for his disabled father for 12 years. After watching the episode, He calculated what professional care would have cost. He then apologized for telling people she did not work. Another man said his wife's online craft business had paid their mortgage during his unemployment, but he had continued calling it a hobby. The episode created a larger conversation about invisible labor. People discussed cooking, cleaning, budgeting, emotional support, transportation, school appointments, medical care, and career sacrifice. Nora did not believe every contribution needed a dollar value, but she did believe people often ignored work until they had to pay someone else to perform it. Sunday Table Bakery opened 4 months later. The storefront had warm lighting, wooden tables, and photographs of Evelyn's original kitchen. Near the entrance stood a long community table. Above it was a sign, "Everybody deserves a place at the table." The bakery sold cakes, pies, bread, breakfast trays, and family meals. One side of the kitchen prepared free food boxes for caregivers. Hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and community organizations referred families. Each box contained enough food for several days. A card inside read, "You are taking care of someone. Today, let someone take care of you." Beatrice attended the opening in a wheelchair. She touched the sign and began crying. "This is your mother," she said slowly. Nora nodded. Yes. Glenn stood several feet away. He did not give a long speech about how much he had supported the opening. He understood that the day belonged to Nora. When a reporter asked him about the bakery, Glenn said, "My wife built this business over many years while also holding our family together." The reporter asked whether he had helped. Glenn answered honestly, "I helped with the shelves and delivery van." Then he smiled. But the vision, customers, recipes, savings, and work belonged to her. Nora heard the answer. It was a small moment, but it showed change. Caleb became involved in the caregiver meal program. He understood the strain medical crises placed on families. He designed an accessible online system through which hospitals could request meals. Jasmine became the bakery's marketing director. Marcus continued managing financial reporting. Nora hired 2 women returning to work after years of caregiving. One had cared for a husband with cancer. The other had raised a child with complex medical needs. Both women worried that the gap in their earsomes made them unqualified. Nora told them, "Caregiving did not remove your skills. It built skills most workplaces fail to recognize." The bakery created flexible schedules for employees supporting relatives at home. Nora did not want workers to choose between family emergencies and employment. The caregiver meal program expanded. During its first year, Sunday Table Bakery provided more than 8,000 meals. Some families sent thank you letters. One came from a father whose wife had suffered a stroke. He wrote that he had spent every day at the hospital and had eaten vending machine food for almost a week. The meal box arrived on the day he felt he could not continue. The card inside made him cry. He later visited the bakery and thanked Nora. "You reminded me I was a person too," he said. Nora understood caregivers often disappeared inside the needs of others. She had done it for years. Glenn's change continued through counseling. He examined why he had tied his identity so closely to providing money. His father had lost work several times when Glenn was young. Glenn remembered hearing arguments about bills. He promised himself he would become the man who always provided. That goal helped him work hard. It also created fear. When Nora provided during his unemployment, Glenn did not experience it only as partnership. He experienced it as proof that he had failed. Instead of facing that shame, he rewrote the story. He told himself the bakery income was not serious. He minimized Nora's work. He called himself the person carrying everyone. Counseling helped him understand that a family was not a competition over who was needed most. Nora's strength did not reduce his. Her contribution did not cancel his. Glenn began correcting the way he spoke. At work, he stopped saying, "My salary paid for everything." He said, "My wife and I supported the family in different seasons." When coworkers joked about wives spending money, Glenn did not join them. He told one colleague, "You might be surprised what keeps your life functioning." At home, Glenn became more involved. He attended Beatrice's medical appointments. He learned her medication schedule. He cooked twice a week. His first meals were not good. Nora did not laugh. She remembered how often her own learning had been dismissed. Glenn also volunteered at the bakery's caregiver program one Saturday each month. During his first shift, he prepared delivery boxes. After 3 hours, his back hurt. The orders continued. He looked toward Nora. "You did this after taking care of Mom all day?" "For years." "And then you woke up early?" "Yes." Glenn shook his head. "I do not understand how." Nora smiled slightly. "You did not have to understand it before. You only had to believe me." He nodded. "I know." 1 year after the original appearance, the Parker family returned to Family Feud for a follow-up. Steve stood at center stage while a video showed Sunday Table Bakery. The audience saw the community table. They saw volunteers packing caregiver meals. They saw Caleb managing online requests. They saw Beatrice sitting beneath Evelyn's photograph. They saw Glenn delivering food boxes. When the video ended, Nora walked onto the stage wearing a white baker's jacket over a burgundy dress. The audience stood. Steve hugged her. Businesswoman Nora laughed. "Yes, sir. How is the hobby?" The audience laughed loudly. Nora smiled. "The hobby has 14 employees." Steve raised his eyebrows. 14? "And we are preparing to open a second kitchen." The audience applauded. Glenn walked onto the stage next. Steve looked at him. "You still carrying the whole family?" Glenn shook his head. "No." The audience laughed. "What did you learn?" Glenn looked toward Nora. "I learned that I had counted only the work that made me feel important." The room became quiet. "I counted my salary. I counted my promotions. I counted the bills paid from my account." He continued, "But I did not count the nights she stayed awake. I did not count the care she gave our son and my mother. I did not count the business income when it protected me." Nora's eyes filled with tears. Glenn looked toward the camera. "I called her work nothing, because admitting what it was would have forced me to admit how often I depended on her." The audience applauded. Steve turned toward Nora. "What did you learn?" Nora thought for a moment. "I learned that humility does not require disappearing." She touched the rolling pin necklace. "I believed that as long as the family survived, it did not matter who received credit." She continued, "But when your contribution remains invisible, people can begin treating your sacrifice as an obligation." The audience became quiet. "You can love your family and still name what you bring to it." Steve nodded. "That is right." He asked whether Nora had forgiven Glenn. Nora looked toward her husband. "I have forgiven him." Glenn smiled faintly. But forgiveness did not mean returning to the old arrangement. His smile faded into understanding. "We changed the arrangement." Steve looked toward the main camera. "A family is not held together only by the person whose name appears on the largest paycheck." He spoke slowly. "It is held together by time, care, honesty, sacrifice, patience, and work." He pointed toward Nora. "This woman baked cakes." The audience listened. She also paid mortgages. She supported children. She cared for a mother who had suffered a stroke. She paid a debt she did not create. She protected a husband who was too ashamed to tell the truth. Steve looked toward Glenn. "And then that husband stood on this stage and said she contributed nothing." Glenn nodded. "It was a lie." The audience applauded. Steve turned back toward Nora, not because she had to prove her value with money. He continued, "The money only made the lie easier to expose." Nora stood beneath the studio lights with her family beside her. She had spent most of her adult life working behind the scenes. She had allowed Glenn to receive praise because she believed marriage was not a competition. She had been right about that. Marriage was not a competition, but it also was not a story in which one person received credit while another person carried the weight. Glenn believed contribution was something visible, a job title, a salary, a company office. Nora's contribution appeared differently. It appeared in Caleb's independence, in Beatrice's recovery, in Jasmine's education, in the home that remained theirs during unemployment, in the tax debt that never reached Glenn's employer, and finally, in a bakery filled with families who needed a place at the table. Glenn said his wife contributed nothing. Steve exposed the lie with questions. Who paid the mortgage? Who cared for the family? Who protected the home? Who gave up a dream? Who built another one quietly? Every answer pointed toward Nora. She had never contributed nothing. The truth was that she had contributed so much, the family had stopped noticing how often its survival began with her.